Okay, we're going to begin our next presentation, and Morton Swimmer, Andrew Lee, and Nick FitzGerald have been friends of mine and mentors in the industry for a long time, and I have no doubt they're going to have a highly interesting presentation. And Nick did inform me that, in fact, the Kobayashi Maru dilemma is not how to choose your sushi.
I don't believe in the no-win scenario.
You are looking at the only Starfleet cadet who ever beat the no-win scenario.
I don't believe in no-win scenarios.
This is the Kobayashi Maru. 19 periods out of all Tier 6. We have struck a gravitic mine and have lost all power. Our hull is penetrated and we have sustained...
The Kobayashi Maru scenario frequently wreaks havoc with students and equipment. As I recall, you took the test 3 times yourself. Your final solution was, shall we say, unique.
Jim, it's the Kobayashi Maru. No one passes the test, and no one goes back for seconds, let alone thirds.
The Kobayashi Maru, sir. Will you tell me what you did?
I reprogrammed the simulation so it was possible to rescue the ship.
So, we've managed to eliminate all enemy ships. No one on board was injured, and the successful rescue of the Kobayashi Maru crew is underway.
I don't like to lose.
So, you'll have to bear with me, I've got laryngitis. Did that make any sense? Yeah. Andy's going to take over if I fall over or my voice completely dies. Anyway, that was just a little introduction, obviously, to explain the title of the paper. And the point was that Kirk didn't like losing, didn't believe in no-win situations, and he was in a position where he could actually change the game. And so he did. Or you could say he cheated. And the whole thought that sort of triggered off this paper was, are there things that we can do to change the game so that we're not always playing second fiddle, trying to play catch-up? This is just, I was going to read these and explain them, but I'm not, for obvious reasons. I'll give you a second to read it. This is an odd place to start, perhaps, but it sort of makes sense, I think. What was the best thing about Office 97? Maybe it was Clippy. You can't tell from that slide, but that's the Visual Basic for applications. It was the new, much more advanced macro development environment that was in several of the Office 97 applications, particularly Word and Excel. And the bad guys that wrote macro viruses really liked it too. But a little more about that in a second. What was the worst thing about Office 97? Does anyone know what that is? Yeah. Does anyone not know what concept is? Yeah, very good. I wasn't bad in any way at all. Couldn't possibly be. And the point is that by the time Office 97 came out, there'd been a very large macro virus problem, and it was just getting worse. And Microsoft in the early days had been it's not really a big issue, and they didn't take really serious steps to try to implement. I'm sure people at Microsoft looked at what could be done, but to actually implement useful and successful strategy changes that might have made it very difficult for the macro virus writers to continue. Anyway, so the worst thing about Office 97, it wasn't concept. The worst thing about Office 97, Word 97 rather in particular, was this macro security joke that Microsoft put in it. If you opened a document in a default installation, if you opened a document that had a macro in it, this warning would pop up. And it offered in a whole lot of verbiage that no one wanted to read or understand because they just wanted to get on and get their work done. It explained, or tried to explain, that macros might be bad. They might do bad things you might not want them to run. And it gave you the option to disable the macro and keep opening the document, to enable the macro and keep opening the document, or to not open the document at all. A lot of people, of course, took the default, but quite a few people, based on their experience with the high quality of Windows and other Microsoft software, knew from much painful experience that if you disabled anything, usually something bad would happen. You wouldn't be able to print something, and so a significant, not large, but a significant number of people at some point or other, for perfectly not good reasons, but what they thought would or might be, would click the enable macros button. And the reason that's a problem is the macro could do anything, including turn off the setting that made this warning appear, so you would never see it again. Okay, what was the best thing about Office 2000? In Word 2000, Microsoft got serious at long last after enormous complaints from the user base about macro viruses, and they put a much better macro security model in, and by default, it was set to high. And the good thing about high macro virus security in Office Word 2000 was that if you ran with it set at high and you opened any document with a macro in it, it only gave you the option to disable the bloody things, okay? The example here is a document that had a signed macro and that was validly signed by a certificate that tracked back down the chain. And so, in that case, the words in the middle were different depending on the exact scenario. But in that case, we had a validly signed macro. You could click the "We always trust macros" from the source, and then you'd be able to enable the macros, and then any future document you got that had signed macros, validly signed macros from the same source, they would open, and the macros would be enabled in the document as well. Why is that important? The whole Word 2000 macro security model versus the joke that came before it. It's important because this is what happened to macro viruses, which were an enormous problem up to about 2001, 2002. The prevalence just plummeted. Okay, so Microsoft changed the game. They made it much harder for the macro malware to get its initial toehold in, and there were other things that happened as well in the whole malware landscape. But the bad guys would have eventually given up, I think, and they did. I mean, you can't actually tell from this graph, but by about early 2004, macro virus prevalence, macro malware prevalence was basically at 0%. And it's pretty much stayed there until recently. It's a different issue we won't get into. So, trying to remember what I was going to say next. Good guys won, bad guys nil. And I can't believe I'm saying that about Microsoft, but I just did. So take a photo before it goes away. I'm going to give my voice a rest for a second.
So one of the things that was really kind of instructive in that scenario that Nick just talked about, and is always the scenario, in fact, in everything that we're going to look at, this really could be said to be true, is what it does is it changes the game for a little while, it raises the bar, moves things around a little bit, and actually what Nick's graph just showed you just there doesn't tell the whole story, because what actually happened, although malware for macros went away, that was really about the time that VBS started on its rise, and just the attackers had to shift somewhere else. But of course, there's a cost for them to do so. And there have been several other security kind of game changes that we've heard about, talked about over the years. Address space layout randomization, something that Linux had for a long time, took Microsoft a long, long time to climb on that bus. They eventually did, but by then the attackers were already kind of ahead of that game, saw the writing on the wall, what was going to happen, moved on, and were able to basically deal with the fact that ASLR is there. Encryption has always been kind of touted as a way to get around malware. If everything's encrypted, you can't have your data stolen, all that kind of thing. Of course, we know that encryption, the biggest problem with encryption is implementation, and there are lots of bad implementations of encryption, lots of things, and ultimately it doesn't necessarily stop anything to do with malware, because ultimately, a lot of these things, unfortunately, malware doesn't just infect hosts and things, it infects people's brains, and not like things that have infected Nick's throat or something like that. You know, sometimes the user is the vulnerable part, right? So we thought we had a presentation that would be great. Nick gets infected, and suddenly things are all screwed up. So, now, two-factor authentication, another thing, very useful tool, very, very powerful in some ways. Again, implementation's a problem, and also there are ways to subvert that, because you can subvert the user, or you can maybe use some malware to subvert the process by which you're getting your two-factor authentication. If you can steal the keys, perhaps, for the seed for your token, or if you can infect the phone that generates your security key. Capture was another thing. You know, it started off very simple, little things that you just had to type in what the text said, and then the attackers said, "Oh, that's a good idea. Why don't we use OCR? Let's do OCR. We'll extract that out, and we'll just dump it back in." So then we made it much more hard, and now you get these blurry images that nobody can even read. So you just outsource it to Pakistan, and those guys give you an answer in 3 seconds flat. Tar pitting, you know, slowing things down. If you see an unusual behavior, just slow down, throttle things. Don't let the attacker, you know, exfiltrate all your data so quickly. All that kind of stuff. Making things run slowly doesn't really help your user experiences that much. And then, of course, you've got economic measures, and we've heard about that today from Igor. We've talked about tagans, and we've talked about the way that you can perhaps change the model and make it more expensive for things. There have been things proposed for spam. There have been things proposed for malware, just to try and make things a little bit more expensive for an attacker. Those things do work. They change the game, but they shifted elsewhere. One of the big things, there was all these pharma scams, all those kind of spam that was coming out. That kind of went away because ChronoPay got shut down and no one could process their payments anymore. So maybe a big game changer is to get, you know, the Visas and the MasterCards of the world to just aggressively shut down payment gateways for these guys. Those things are all game changers in some senses because they shift focus, but none of them are the final solution.
Thanks, Andy. So I'm going to run through a couple of very esoteric things that I'm not proposing that these themselves are things that might scale or things that you would want to do, but there are questions raised along the way in the next couple of minutes that any kind of automated or semi-automated system, yeah, you've got 10,000, 100,000 VMs sitting in your server farm furiously analyzing URLs that are pouring in, and you're trying to work out whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. And there's some issues that even when you're just doing it manually rather than on an industrial scale, you maybe should be aware of. What you can't see on that screenshot, you can probably tell. You can probably tell it's an eBay fish. But this was very, very common once upon a time. It's all but disappeared. But it's an FTP URL. And it's not only an FTP URL, but it's an FTP URL with a username and a password in it. So if you happen to have that fish URL and you're potentially analyzing it, looking at where it came from, the fish email itself has given you a set of user credentials and a site that they belong to. Is it okay, like you can log in with FTP, is it okay to delete the phishing page or to upload a replacement for the phishing page? That's just a warning, a harmless warning. What about logging into the hosting provider for that site using those user credentials and having a look around? You'd be able to, depending on how what services they offer and how it's configured, you may get access to a lot more files than just the stuff that's accessible through the FTP interface. What about copying those files, if there are some? If there are files that you can get to through the control panel interface, what about copying them and looking and analysing them, seeing if there are pointers to other bad stuff, which you might want to protect your users from? And in the old days when this was common, back in the early 2000s, it was also very common that the free hosting places had very, very little authentication beyond the fact that if you could log in, they'd let you change. So you could change the password or the email address in the user account through the control panel. And it wouldn't send email to the original address as a confirmation check or anything like that. Would it be okay to do that? So you change the phishing page so it's harmless, so anyone who's still got the email and hasn't clicked on the link doesn't get in trouble. Change the account details so that the person who owned the account can't log back in by changing the password, and change the email address so that they can't recover it because they now they can't prove that they ever owned it. And those are open questions. I'm going to move on to the next example. This is a more contemporary example, but almost the same thing. This is a PayPal fish, and well, you can't really see that horrible URL, but you don't really need to. It's a chemicalproofflooring.com. It's an Indian company with a .com domain name. And that's the phishing page. And anyway, so at this point, you've got the URL to this fish page. It's obviously it's fairly likely that it's a compromised server. Someone's installed a fish somewhere after getting access to something they shouldn't. Is it okay to dig around on that server using directory traversal? Yeah, chop the last bit off the URL and see what happens. Chop the next bit off. Is that okay? You might find something interesting, like a phishing kit, which might help you more definitively detect more of the things from the same kit in the future. Or maybe you'll find a data drop file, and depending on what you do and the responsibilities of your company, maybe reporting the fraud that's recorded in that file would be something that you want to do, or that in fact your company does, or you may have a good working relationship with the brand and you'd forward that data to them, as well as informing them about the fish so they can keep monitoring. Or you might even find a shell. And if you did, is it okay to then dig around even deeper on that web server? And now, do as I say, not as I do, okay? If you knock the first level or the last level off the URL, it redirects you to a different version of the same phishing page. You go back 2 levels, it does the same. You go back 3 levels, it does the same. You go back 4 levels, and you get this directory. And it's full of image files, mostly JPEGs and PNGs, the odd PDF. And the log directory at the bottom is the next level down, which is the first phishing directory that redirects you to a phishing page. But if you, half a minute. Buried in amongst all those numeric graphics files, there's a PHP file. Just one in the whole page. Believe me, I won't try and prove it. And now you can go looking around. There is that PHP file does happen to be a shell. And the nice thing about this particular case is that I'd been looking for this kit for ages. And there it was, so I could find it down. I couldn't download it from that directory without knowing its name. It's got an obscure name, but now I've found it using the shell. And I could go spelunking around the rest of the server, which I'm not going to bore you with now. But is that a good idea? So, was it? I'll do Dan. I think I can get through this. Dan Cuthbert was a penetration tester working for ABN AMRO back in the early 2000s in the UK. He was working on New Year's Eve just after the Indian Ocean tsunami, and he decided he'd make a donation to one of the big charities in the UK. He went to their website, filled in the donation form, put in his credit card, etc., filled in all the details, hit submit, and it was very, very slow. The service response was very, very slow, and he never got a confirmation page, a thank you, anything like that. And then he sort of sat there and he thought, actually, the graphics on this site looked a bit dodgy, looked a bit cheap, looked a bit low rent. Maybe I've been fished. And he started doing the sort of things that you just saw me doing there, chopping bits off URLs. And he convinced himself from doing that, because his day job's a penetration tester, he very quickly convinced himself that it was probably okay. And he went back to what he was doing. But 8 months later, 10 months later, he was convicted in court for unauthorized access. There was a jury trial, and there were arguments for and against, but the jury basically accepted the prosecution's argument that as a professional computer security expert, he should have known that changing URLs and fiddling around like he was doing was not an authorized use of the website. Those URLs he was trying to access were not directly accessible as links somewhere on the website or published elsewhere under the control of the people that own the website. And therefore he had made unauthorized access. So what you just saw me doing, if that machine was in the UK, which it wasn't, it's actually all running on my machine here, but if that was in the UK, I may be technically just committed an offence under the UK Computer Misuse Act. And all of your server farms that are busy doing the same thing automatically to hundreds of thousands of URLs a day, they are too.
So yeah, obviously a more recent case, a bit more well-known. Very similar scenario. So Andrew Auernheimer, we can say what we like about him as a person or a character, and I think he's a douchebag. I'll say that publicly. But you know what he actually did in this specific instance, no matter what else he's done, what he simply did was realize that there was a sequential way to access the data on a web server, and so he just automated that and did it at scale. And so perhaps more because it embarrassed some very powerful people than anything else, he ended up being convicted, serving 41 months in a federal prison and being fined $73,000 for basically just looking at various things on a web server. So as Nick has explained, it's possible to do all these things. Is that a way that we want to proceed ethically? We've had this thing in the industry of trying not to do things which we see as being ethically challenging. So we tend to shy away from that. That's worked pretty well for us. But there are also areas where we have probably crossed that line, even with automated systems where we're going and downloading things. Now you can say very easily, it's very unlikely that a criminal is going to try and get a prosecution against you because of, you've done something bad to his malware server. However, if it's a compromised server belonging to a legitimate company, and it's been compromised by malware, that company might legitimately go after you as a researcher and say, well, you shouldn't have been poking around in my server, and maybe you caused me to get infected with malware, and all those kind of things. So it's problematic, to say the least. And these things are not easy to decide. But we're kind of blasting through a lot of this. Much more of it is in the paper. We're really blasting through this because we want to get to some of the more kind of the interesting stuff, which is the questions that we want to ask you. Another thing that we've kind of looked at is this is the Postel thesis. So John Postel was one of the original the RFC editors, and he formulated this very simple principle, which is sometimes called Postel's law, which basically says implementation should be conservative in its sending behavior and liberal in its receiving behavior. And so it's really basically this kind of anti-engineering thesis, which, don't overdo shit. So, we should make sure that things are actually sound in the way that they work, not just that they work. And if you look at some of the things that we could have better if we had done things nicely in the first place, we wouldn't have so much spam because actually strict implementations of spam, SMTP, would actually drop a lot of spam because they're strict, because they don't allow certain behaviors that spammers use. So there's an example of an anti-postal. So grey listing, again, it's dropping a lot of it because we're not really kind of very willing to be helpful. Where the server doesn't really recognize something, it just kind of says, no, I don't think so. So there are ways that if we had done things more strictly, we could have been better. Does anyone else have some suggestions? Like what other things that might have been a good, just quickly? Well, one is, if I'll add them because I wrote paper. So. One would be that would be pretty cool if we had done nice things with file formats, and those file formats did the stuff that those file formats were supposed to do. So we actually had strict PE format that doesn't do all these crazy shenanigans. However, that would break the entire world right at this point. So we can't have that. PDFs should be PDFs, not little media players and things like that. So we've got stuff that is good examples
on that point, there's a paper by Ange Albertini, which is referenced in our paper. And if you want to see how screwed up modern computing systems are, you really want to read what that guy's been up to.
Yeah, it's a really interesting paper to read just how messed up file formats are. So we have some of these things that we could have done, but we probably can't get there from here, so we're probably looking for other ways. Let's bring it right up to date. And Nick, if you can get through this.
I'm going to blast through this quickly, but I hope that you're aware, because there's been quite a lot of news about it, that Flash might be in a bit of trouble. I mean, it's caused a lot of trouble. A couple of months ago, Google, who have their own implementation of Flash, which is a fixed-up version based on code originally from Adobe. But they work out on web pages like this, which is, I'm using the example of one of the news pages. They can work out that sidebar isn't the main page, and that's the main page. And Flash objects that appear in those sidebars and footers and banner ads and all that nonsense, they won't autoplay them, even if they're set to autoplay in the HTML that comes down. About a month later, Alex Stamos, who used to be the CSO at Yahoo and had just moved to Facebook in the same role, tweeted that maybe it was time for Adobe to announce an end-of-life date for Flash. He's saying it would be some way off, but set a date now and everyone will know when they can actually just kill it for good. A couple of days later, Firefox turned off every single version of Flash in the browser, because this was just after the hacking team disclosures, and there were 3, I think it was, known, and it actually turned out a couple of days later that I think there were 2 more the hacking team had that hadn't been found at that point. There were 3 Flash 0 days that were being, at least one of which was being actively exploited in the world, and others were quickly added as people worked out from the hacking team. And then in Facebook's 10Q quarterly filing for April-June 2015, which was filed on the 30th of July, they added a little bit of language, which was really interesting, I think. In this standard section of this filing, risks related to our business and industry, they added or vulnerabilities wherever they'd previously only mentioned software errors or bugs. I've just put the bits in red there that they added, but this is the really interesting bit. They added this whole, it was actually 2 paragraphs, I've run it together. They added this whole thing.
So what they're actually pointing out is that some of their core technologies, their social games on Facebook actually rely on Flash, and that's actually responsible for most of their payment revenue. So just think about that. Facebook is essentially an operating system. And if they can control that operating system, you kind of constrain certain things, but their core technology from which they make nearly all of their money is based on Flash. And yet, their certain vulnerabilities have caused problems for them. And that may well disrupt their ability to provide these games, and their generation of revenue will be harmed. But it's interesting then that Alex on the other side of that is then saying, well, let's turn Flash off. So we're wondering how that Facebook's actually going to achieve that if the only way they're making money is from Flash.
Amazon advertising got in on it as well, and as of the 1st of September, they've stopped accepting SWF ads for display on any Amazon properties. Maybe this is the end of Flash. What do you think?
So at this point,
that's the question slide.
I could answer, but I'd like to know from the audience, what do you think? Can we get rid of Flash or not? Do you think that's going to work? Is it going to happen? Sorry, where are you? I didn't see you. Over there. And in particular, why?
Granted, if turning off Flash at the browser is pretty much a hard stop across the board, if there is some sort of agreement, obviously anything I say doesn't apply, but it does still seem like, especially on the borderline and gray parts of the web, Flash is still very widely used, and I think because it's easily deployed, it's going to be probably 2016 is too soon. I would love to see it gone tomorrow, but I don't see it.
Any other takers?
Sorry, we're being kicked swiftly up the. Sorry. Oh, sorry. I thought you were doing the time thing. Well, it's hard to see with these lights.
So
please
who else?
continue.
Somebody else had an answer. Where?
I can't say anyone.
Okay, all right. Well,
sure, someone must have an idea.
Okay, so I don't think it's going to happen. Or I think it might happen, but if it happens, we might find ourselves in the worst of possible worlds, whereby people will have to revert for their own internet use to old versions of browsers that don't get updated, old Flash versions that don't get updated. So this sort of game changer, while it sounds great, I mean, I'd love to get rid of Flash, might totally backfire on us.
Yeah.
That would be my answer.
There's a lot of unintended consequences with all of these things, and there's a lot of economic factors that drive it. And I think one of the things that we are constantly up against is that there are lots and lots of attacks and lots of attack surfaces, and those keep moving, and attackers like very vulnerable stuff. And so we might finally secure PCs. We might finally get nice encryption on our networks, but will we be able to secure all of the Android devices out there that no one's got an economic incentive to update? And will we be able to fix the Internet of Terrible Things? Who knows? Regard.
Yeah, so I would love for it to be killed. But one problem is, for instance, if I look at my own son in school, all the educational software is Flash. We are still seeing Internet Explorer 6 in companies, in corporates, simply because they have applications that require functionality which is only there in Internet Explorer 6. I wish it would go, but I'm afraid that without globally killing it, it will stay.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions or suggestions?
We're out of time now.
Okay, so just one very final thing. We haven't finished this conversation. This paper was really just to open up the question. Morton is walking around, and he's got a big recorder thingy that he's willing to stick in your face so you can record your answers to this. And please watch Martin's blog for an announcement next week about what we're going to do as a follow-up to this paper, because 30 minutes really wasn't enough to scratch the surface.
And Morton, can you come up on stage too, please? I'd like to thank our presenters today.